Welcome everyone to episode 58. If you've been listening to the series on the Kingdom Plantae, then you've just listened to episodes about green algae, about the bryophytes known as mosses and liverworts, and most recently, about lycophytes and ferns. Today's episode will continue onwards down the evolutionary lineage that is the plant kingdom, to the next major divergence, the emergence of the spermatophytes, or the seed plants. Over millions of years, these seed plants have diversified into an extremely diverse range of species. Many of these have gone extinct, but among those that still exist in the modern day, they can be divided into 5 major groups. There's the Pinophyta, the Cycadophyta, the Ginkgophyta, the Gnetophyta, and the Magnoliophyta. Of these 5 major groups of seed plants, only the Magnoliophyta have flowers. These are the Angiosperms. The 4 other groups are all called Gymnosperms, and they will be the focus of today's episode. The Angiosperms will be the focus of the next episode. The evolutionary capacity to use seeds instead of spores was catalyzed by 2 major evolutionary events. They were both cases of major gene duplication and subsequent diversification, which gave rise to the gene groups responsible for seed and flower development. The very first case of gene duplication occurred in the early Carboniferous period, about 319 million years ago. This major mutation modified the sporangia and turned the megaspores into very primitive seeds. The second case of gene duplication occurred in the very early days of the Jurassic period, about 190 million years ago. This would lead to the emergence and diversification of the genes involved in the production of flowers, which is what defines the angiosperms, or the flowering plants. But I'm going to talk about all of these in much more detail in the next episode. Today is all about the gymnosperms, which are all of the seed plants that don't express flowers. The early ancestors of the seed plants began to appear almost 400 million years ago in the form of the progymnosperms. These ancient, extinct plants had traits that we associate not just with the vascular plants like the ferns that they arose from, but the modern conifers and flowering plants. These progymnosperm ancestor plants had woody tissue with xylem and phloem, and the vascular cambium for secondary growth. Many of these progymnosperms came from fern-like ancestors that were heterosporous, which exhibits the slow evolutionary emergence of specialized, sexually dimorphic spores, like megaspores and microspores. Eventually, an individual within a population of these progymnosperms experienced the first of those 2 major gene duplications, and they experienced a radically altered expression of their spores. This trait was advantageous. The spores were more protected, and they could last longer, and they could endure desiccation. And so, naturally, because of all of these advantages, the trait spread throughout the population, and this laid the groundwork for the emergence of the first true gymnosperms, which would come to dominate the tropical rainforests by outcompeting other species of plant, like lycophytes and giant ferns. In much the same way that flowering plants use animals like bees or butterflies or hummingbirds to transport pollen between individuals so as to aid in their reproduction, some gymnosperms have also evolved these mutualist symbiotic relationships. For example, the calligrammatid lacewings are insects that are really similar to butterflies, but they went extinct long before modern butterflies actually emerged. These calligrammatid lacewings are so similar because of convergent evolution and their morphology, their pigmentation, and their development. But for the purposes of today's episode, the only relevant similarity is their mouth parts, which allows both the calligrammatid and the modern butterfly to suck up fluids from within a flower, like nectar. The modern butterfly uses its proboscis to drink the nectar of a flowering plant, while the extinct calligrammatid probably used its thicker, sturdier proboscis to penetrate the harder ovum of gymnosperm species that existed at the same time, like Bienia, Catonia, Catonianthus, Williamsonia and Weltrichia. Other animal species have been described as having developed these mutualist pollinator relationships during the Jurassic and early Cretaceous periods. Various species of scorpion flies and the order Mecoptera had developed rudimentary proboscis organs, which they used to suck at the nutrient-rich secretions coming out of the seed-producing ovule. Gymnosperms, like some of the Catoniacea, the Pentoxylacea, and the Nettles, which all existed around the same time and in the same place as these scorpion flies, had evolved a particular ovule structure and morphology that one study described as, quote, either unusual for wind pollination or possess structures that would be expected for long proboscoid fluid feeding, unquote. However, pretty much all of these mutualist relationships between pollinators and gymnosperms were disrupted or outright destroyed when the angiosperms appeared and achieved ecological dominance sometime in the mid to late Cretaceous. The angiosperms' rapid diversification and spread over the landscape either stole the gymnosperms' pollinators or brought with them pollinators of their own that outcompeted the gymnosperm pollinators. However it happened, the emergence and diversification of the flowering plants led to the disappearance of the gymnosperm mutualist relationships along with their pollinators. Although life is adaptable, plastic, and moldable, and it was only a matter of time until new mutualist relationships were established. Interestingly, many cycads have recently developed mutualist relationships with various beetles. One of the gymnosperm groups used to be quite widespread and diverse, but also suffered a relatively rapid period wherein the number of species dwindled to near zero. This group is the ginkgos, which are a relatively small gymnosperm group with 11 known species. Of these known species, they're all extinct, save for only a single one, called the Ginkgobiloba. This species struggled to survive in central China through the end of the Cretaceous and the whole Cenozoic era, in a world where every other ginkgo species was dying or long gone. The surviving species, Ginkgobiloba, has fan-shaped leaves, which have a thick, leathery texture, and they're known during the autumn season to turn from green to yellow very quickly, in the span of just 1 or 2 days. They possess nutritious seeds that are often harvested and used in Chinese cuisine. Although, to get to the seeds, you have to scrape off all of the fruit flesh covering it. The fruit tissue of the Ginkgobiloba produces hexanoic and butanoic acids, which make it smell absolutely terrible. But after the fruit flesh has been removed and the seeds have been cleaned, they don't have this scent. The seeds don't have the hexanoic and butanoic acids. So the seeds, once they've been cleaned, smell totally fine. But the fruit tissue itself that you've discarded still smells like a huge pile of puke or a rotting corpse locked in a small room on a hot day. It doesn't taste good either. An interesting detail about the ginkgos is that because of a confluence of factors about their behavior and their life strategies, they are remarkably slow to evolve. First, ginkgos are extremely long-lived, with the oldest individual ginkgo trees being somewhere on the order of 1,500 years old. Many of these most ancient ginkgo trees existed near Buddhist or Confucian temples, where the local monks, instead of cutting the trees down, would cultivate them and harvest their seeds for food. The ginkgos are also relatively slow to reproduce, and in the wetlands of China, they were able to spread out across a virtually continuous expanse of ground. With such long lives, the ginkgos can reproduce and reintroduce their genes into the gene pool hundreds of years after they might have last reproduced. With these slow reproduction times, the statistical probability of an emergent mutation being beneficial and then being spread across the population is less per unit time than it would be in species that have faster reproduction cycles. Because of the ginkgo's continuous carpeting of the landscape, the many billions of ginkgo plants created a continuous genetic gradient, where traits from one end of the geographic range could slowly move to the other end through an unbroken stretch of habitat. All of these factors contribute to suppressed divergence and speciation, which gave the ginkgo some degree of phenotypic and genotypic plasticity, but prevented them from fully diverging and speciating too often. The single surviving ginkgo species is a distant relative to all of the other gymnosperms, for two reasons. The first one is that the ginkgos were some of the first plants that diverged from the main gymnosperm lineage. So even though they evolved slowly, they've had more time to evolve away from the rest of the gymnosperms than any other gymnosperm species. The second reason is that all of the intermediate ginkgo species that had closer genetic ties to the common ancestor have all gone extinct. But despite this relative distance, no pun intended, the ginkgos can still be tied into the gymnosperm family. For example, they reproduce with sperm that possess flagella, so as to swim through water, which is a trait that the ginkgos share with cycads. The cycads are another early divergence in the gymnosperm line, and there's evidence to support the hypothesis that they share a common ancestor with ginkgos, that itself diverged from the rest of the gymnosperms relatively early, sometime more than 300 million years ago. These cycads are dioecious plants, meaning that individuals are either entirely male or entirely female. There are 0 monoecious plants with both male and female sex structures. And because of this, cycads cannot reproduce asexually. They have to engage in sexual reproduction to make offspring. Like their ginkgo cousin, the cycads grow and reproduce relatively slowly, and they have very long lives, with some cycad individuals being more than 1,000 years old. However, where the ginkgo grow wild only in a small spot in central China, the cycads grow wild on every continent except for Europe and Antarctica. They grow in the tropics and subtropics, in places like Florida, Mesoamerica, and the northern forests and tropical grasslands of South America. They grow over almost the entirety of Africa south of the Sahel, and they grow across the entirety of the Southeast Asian archipelago, from India, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and other countries on the mainland, to Malaysia and Indonesia, to Papua New Guinea, and much of the coastal area of Australia. The cycads have really interesting growth patterns. They have a primary trunk that doesn't branch out. It doesn't make branches like so many other plants do. Instead, the leaves grow directly out from the trunk itself. Think of the apical meristem on a plant, the group of stem cells at the very tip of the growing shoot that rises up into the air as they divide to produce cells that mature and grow beneath them. Much the same way, the active leaves of a cycad will grow out of the top of the shoot. As the leaves grow and age, ultimately they'll dry out and die off. They'll fall off of the plant, and they'll leave behind a cratered socket, or a cavity in the stem where they were once growing. In the larger cycads that grow to the size of trees, these are what makes their woody stems look so gnarled and rough. By looking at the pits and cavities in the stem, you're looking at the life history of this plant. You're seeing all of the previous leaves that once helped it grow when it was younger, but have since fallen off in the wake of newer growth continually higher up the plant. The uppermost portion is where the new leaves grow, so as the old leaves mature and die, they push the point of new leaf growth up and up and up, and the stem grows and the plant gets taller. This growth form can make taller cycads look really similar to palm trees, except palm trees are a group of flowering plants that emerged many millions of years after cycads did. While taller cycads can reach the height of trees, the smaller cycad species are just a few centimeters tall. In a throwback to their immediate evolutionary ancestors, the leaves on a cycad look a lot like the leaves on a fern. They're pinnate leaves, with a central stalk that has long, narrow leaflets coming out in pairs on either side, like ribs coming out of the vertebral column. Some species of cycads have double pinnate leaves, or bipinnate leaves, which are like a fractalized version of regular pinnate leaves. In the leaves of these plants, you have the main central stalk, or the central vein, coming out to form the main leaf. But instead of pinnate leaves branching out of this main stalk, instead, there's smaller stalks coming out, and all of the pinnate leaves grow on these secondary stalks. Or in other cases, the vein running down the center of the pinnate leaf itself may branch and have new leaves form on that, so you get these interesting fractalized versions of this leaf growth. So where the ginkgo and the cycads diverged early in the gymnosperm story, the conifers and the gnetophytes would diverge a little later on. The gnetophytes are a small group, with only some 70 or so closely related species divided into 3 major genuses. The Gnetum genus exists in tropical climates, where they have a heavy presence in the Amazon, the Western Congo, and Southeast Asia. The genus Ephedra are more tolerant of colder temperatures and less sunlight, and they've spread out to more temperate areas, like the lands surrounding the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the Anatolian highlands, and beyond that to the bulk of Central Asia. Now you might have noticed that the name ephedra sounds pretty similar to the drug ephedrine. Well, that's no surprise. The drug ephedrine comes from these ephedra gnetophytes. The third genus, the Welwitschia genus, has the smallest range, existing only along a small patch of coastline in Namibia and Angola. All of these gnetophytes in all 3 genuses used to be very widespread, but they have since struggled to adapt to the climate and to other competitors, and their range has been reduced. The defining features that unite all of the gnetophytes are the distinctive leaves called bracts that surround and protect their sexual structures, as well as a similar functional structure that produces a pollen droplet to aid in reproduction. They also have structures in their vascular tissue called vessel elements, which are also found in angiosperms, but curiously, not in any other gymnosperm. You might think that this hints at a close genetic and evolutionary relationship between the needles and the first angiosperms, which directly links the flowering plants to the rest of the seed plants. But it turns out that this is a case of convergent evolution, where each lineage independently produced vessel element structures. But besides these base similarities, the 3 genera of gnetophytes hardly share any similarities with each other at all. They've been described as bizarre and enigmatic, because despite being closely related genetically, they are very morphologically different, as they've adapted to a huge range of habitats, from the temperate dryness of the Mediterranean to the cold, windy peaks of the mountains in Central Asia, to the brutal heat of the Arabian desert, to the tropics of the Amazon and the Congo. Some species, like the Gnetum nemon, grow as trees with huge, broad leaves, while other species, like the Ephedra distachya, grow as small, gnarly little bushes. The only species of Welwitschia is called Welwitschia mirabilis, which is kind of like the Eeyore of plants. The Welwitschia mirabilis has very short woody stems that look like small wooden buckets or bowls. The reproductive structures are generated from the stem and held aloft in the center of the plant, while all of the leaves grow on the outer surface, extending outwards on or near the ground. The tallest mirabilis plants are no more than 1.5 meters tall, but their leaves can be up to 8 meters long. These long, limp leaves often fray or split apart, which gives them the appearance of being a head with long, wet hair barely poking out of the ground. Their leaves are often twisted and dirty, tangled up in a loose mess. It looks like a plant's best attempt at imitating an octopus. And because the leaves are long and thin and limp and frayed, they just look depressed. They are the Eeyore of plants. Despite their extremely limited range near a short span of African coastline, they actually aren't particularly endangered. The main threats that they face are fungal infections that reduce their seed viability, and sometimes they get overgrazed by zebra. Humans aren't much of a problem, especially in Angola, where the landmines from a recent civil war generally do a good job keeping people and large animals away from the plants. The last major group of gymnosperms are the conifers, which are by far the largest and most diverse group of all the seed plants. The conifers include more than 65 genera and more than 600 species. Every species of extant conifer is a perennial plant, with woody stem and branch tissue capable of engaging in secondary growth. The defining features of their evolution are the capacity to handle water stress much better than their relatives, to be able to handle a general lack of water better, and to have seeds and pollen that are perfected for cold, dry climates. Unlike other kinds of trees, and unlike many other plants, the conifers often have a very strong apical dominance, which means they typically grow much taller than they grow wide, and their lateral branching tends to be much less extensive and less complex. The titular quality of the conifer plants is their production of cones. In all conifers, the male cone is small and fragile, with soft herbaceous tissue surrounding a pulpy core. These soft cones are composed of modified leaves called microsporophylls that extend outward from the center, and they tightly overlap one another to form a beautiful geometric pattern that characterizes the cone. Protected under each little microsporophyll is a microsporangia organ that produces and stores pollen. These can dry out and break apart and fall off the tree, or they can be eaten by birds or arboreal rodents. And while these soft male cones are pretty similar from species to species, the female cones are much more diverse. These cones contain the ovule, so they're much harder and sturdier, and just generally more protective of the ovule that will eventually get fertilized to form the seed. You can see the evolutionary value and prioritization with respect to sperm and egg even in the plants. The sperm can be produced in large numbers relatively easily. They're not that nutritionally expensive, and so they can be soft and delicate, and a lot of animals can still eat them, and there's enough left over to still potentially fertilize another plant. But the ovules, the eggs, are larger. They're much more nutritionally expensive, and the number of them is much more limited. As a result, you get these larger, sturdier cones with harder shells that are much less susceptible to being broken apart or consumed or otherwise destroyed by some kind of animal. The most typical conifer cones belong to the Pinaceae family, which includes pine trees, spruce trees, cedar trees, and others. These pine cones have the stereotypical pattern of overlapping scales, which I think is really cool for two reasons. One, the overlapping scales are arranged kind of like fish scales, which gives them a really aesthetically pleasing geometry. And two, what's even cooler about this pleasing geometry is that these patterns match the ratios of the Fibonacci numbers. In these plants, the ovule is surrounded by bracket leaves first, and then the actual scales of the cone begin to form later, as a kind of protective armor for the ovule. When the scales dry out, they'll bend and warp, which opens them up to allow pollen grains to get in. When the scales get wet, like from rain or humid weather, they can seal back up into the tight cone shape. Species of gymnosperm in the Araucariaceae family have fused scales that form a smooth, spherical cone, like a large, hard shell around the seed. And these can grow anywhere from 5 to 30 centimeters in diameter. A lot of cypress plants, like sequoia, junipers, and redwoods, have cones with peltate scales, or scales that aren't overlapping, but are instead separated by a small, narrow space. In monoecious species of pine plants, The female cones are generally grown higher up on the tree than the male cones. This is to discourage self-pollination and to encourage sexual replication, which will produce and maintain healthy genetic variety. In episode 53 on plant reproduction, I talked at length about reproduction with seeds, and how pollination occurs and how the seed forms. So I'm not going to spend time repeating all of that information today, so instead I'll just go over the main points. The pollen grain has a generative cell that develops into a sperm and a pollen tube. The ovule produces 4 gametophyte cells, 3 of which dissolve to leave behind a single cell, that then divides to form a number of egg-producing archegonia. The pollen tube grows outward and reaches into the ovule down to the egg, and sperm will flow down the pollen tube to find and fertilize the egg. After fertilization, a seed will develop, containing an embryo that will generate differentiated tissues. The seed matures and gets released from the cone, where it lands on the ground and can then germinate. The thing about conifer reproduction is that these cones can take many months to more than a year to fully mature, so conifer reproductive cycles can take place over not just 1 year, but across 2 or 3 year cycles. In single-year cycles, the cone forms in the autumn, or sometime later in the year but before the winter. These newly formed cones will then go dormant over the winter, only to reawaken in the spring when they can get pollinated, which will lead to fertilization some 3 to 4 months later. The seeds are shed at the end of the year, so they have to endure another winter before they can fully germinate. In 2-year cycles, the cones form in the fall, and then they wait out the winter, and then they get pollinated next spring. These young cones will spend the whole summer maturing as little conelets, before pollination finally results in fertilization sometime next year, next summer, a full year later, which will then turn them into immature cones. The mature seeds will get released in the second fall season, and overwinter before germinating sometime in the next summer. In the 3-year cycles, the cones form in late summer or early fall. They wait through the winter, and then they get pollinated in the spring, and then they turn into conelets. They wait a year, and by next spring, the conelets are still developing. By the next spring and summer, they finally fertilize and the seeds mature. At this point, the seeds can stay in the cones or be released, but either way, they have to endure another winter before they can germinate and start growing into a new individual. Pollination of these pine plants, regardless of how many years are in their reproductive cycle, is usually achieved by birds from the Corvidae family, like crows, jays, magpies, jackdaws, and ravens, among others. So all of these gymnosperms that I've talked about, from the ginkgos to the pinacea, all have a sporophyte-dominant life cycle, where the large mature plant that grows for tens to hundreds to thousands of years is a diploid sporophyte. In contrast, the haploid gametophyte generation is small and short-lived. The gametophytes are produced in the spores, where they form pollen grains. The pollen grain is the male gametophyte, and it produces sperm cells that can fertilize the megagametophyte, or the female gametophyte. It works something like this. The sporophyte produces microspores and megaspores. These microspores will develop into the male gametophytes, the pollen grains, and they will get released into the wind. The megaspores will develop into the female gametophytes, but they'll stay retained within the archegonia. The ovule has a coating that forms the seed coat, but to be fertilized, the sperm has to make it through the hard outer coating to the egg inside. This is achieved through a structure called a micropyle, which is a very small gap, or a hole in the seed coat. Because this hole is extremely tiny, it might be confusing how pollination occurs. Well, remember how earlier I talked about the pollinators that would feed off of ovular secretions? These insects would come and use their proboscis to drink the nutrient-rich fluid that seeps out of these micropiles. The purpose of this fluid is to physically trap a pollen grain. The pollen grain is floating out there in the wind, very dry, very light, so when it comes in contact with water, it immediately gets soaked and weighed down, trapped by the cohesive and adhesive forces of the water. The gymnosperms will secrete a small amount of this fluid, called a pollination drop, which basically makes the entire area around the micropyle very sticky to any incoming pollen. It increases the surface area that the pollen has to land on to be able to successfully pollinate the plant, which directly increases reproductive success. When the pollen grain gets wetted and stuck to the outer coating of the ovule, it's a simple matter to direct the pollen grain to flow into the micropyle and down into the ovum. Here, the pollen grain begins producing sperm. I mentioned how cycads and ginkgo have mobile sperm equipped with flagellas to swim through the water. Well, here is when those sperm would get released, and they get their chance to swim to the egg. The Gnetophytes and the Conifers, on the other hand, don't have mobile sperm, and so instead they use a pollen tube as a transport corridor to move their sperm to the egg. Once pollination occurs, the seed begins to form. While the conifers are the only group of gymnosperms that produce true cones, the cycads and the Welwitschia mirabilis also produce cone-like structures. These retain a lot of the basic features of the conifer cone, and they work in pretty much the same way, but they just have a more primitive and less refined look to them. For example, cycad cones often grow upwards in irregular, lumpy shapes, like a club or a sock that's been stuffed with wadded-up newspaper. Welwitschia mirabilis produces much smaller cones, but again, they serve the same purpose. In all cases, the male cones will dry out and degrade, releasing the pollen into the wind, while the female cones will dry up and break apart, or get chewed up by animals, or they rot and fall apart, which will reveal the seeds to the greater world around it, and gives it the chance to find fertile ground, to germinate, and to produce a new gymnosperm individual. Okay, so that is about it for gymnosperms. The gymnosperms are really cool plants, with a huge variety of unique and aesthetic growth forms. They've spread out all over the planet, to almost every habitat and biome. That's a very evolutionarily successful group of organisms. Even though it might seem like they're successful today, and I mean they are, the gymnosperms were once the dominant type of plant on the planet. They were once much more widespread, and far more numerous. For millions of years, it was a gymnosperms world. But beginning around 200 million years ago, the angiosperms appeared, and began to shake things up. The angiosperms' flowers brought new colors to the landscape, and opened up new avenues for evolution, for the divergence and speciation of pollinators and parasites, and all manner of other life forms. This floral revolution was powerful enough to unseat the gymnosperms as the dominant form of plant life, usurping their position and replacing them with the flowering plants. I'll talk more about this in the next episode, so if you're interested, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned to check it out. If you're watching this on YouTube, then give the video a like, and if you're listening to this on iTunes, then go into the store and give the podcast a good rating. All of this stuff supports the podcast and helps attract new viewers, and I really appreciate it. And as always, thanks for listening.